Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, just to start off, my name is Michele van Eck. I'm an associate professor and head of the Department of Private Law at the University of Johannesburg in South Africa. And it's an absolute honor to have been invited to present here today and to be part of this workshop. Prof. Borges is obviously also well connected with us at the University of Johannesburg, and we are very excited in terms of these initiatives, being a distinguished visiting professor at the University of Johannesburg. Thank you, Prof. Just a bit of background with regards to what the faculty is doing and also my own research. I am predominantly a contract lawyer and I focus within ethics, but obviously within the space of 4IR and technology. So a big focus of my research sits within the ethical side of AI, as well as the smart contract space within South African context. Very exciting space to be in because the Faculty of Law at the University of Johannesburg and the University of Johannesburg itself is predominantly focused as a big focus area within the AI space. So it's very exciting for me to start with this presentation to really assess the EU AI Act against the South African AI plan. Now, the South African position is very different to the other jurisdictions within the workshop, and I think it would be very good just to start off setting the scene, if I can put it that way, in terms of the socioeconomic and legal framework that currently exists within the South African space. That will then give us context as to the current position within South Africa, which will then flow over into considering that against the EU's AI Act. Now, South Africa has quite a unique position, and the reason for that is that there's obviously a lot of heritage and values that sits within an African context. We have a lot of history in terms of regulations and laws and so on. We have quite a challenge when it comes to infrastructure and resources. So unlike the other jurisdictions like Europe and Japan that we've heard about up to this point, big challenges exist within our data infrastructure and physical infrastructure to support things as simple as internet. So resources and infrastructure is one of the inhibitors that we'll find within our AI strategy. And then obviously the focus within the social development goals. From a legal framework perspective, South Africa has a slightly different legal tradition. We are categorized as a mixed legal system. Now, that means that we have different legal heritages that move from our history. But one of the big things that makes us different is that we don't really have a codified system. So that means that we follow things called the common law, which is predominantly Roman Dutch law and English law, depending on the area of the law we're talking about. We do have some pieces of legislation and regulations, and some of those will flow over into AI regulation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But we also have the concept of customary law. In fact, we have somewhat of a pluralistic legal system, so two branches within the law. The focus in terms of AI regulation would be on the common law, the civil law elements. And what we'll find is, as we're moving along through this presentation, is that although we do have some piecemeal legislation, we do have common law that would create some default rules, it is woefully inadequate in terms of AI regulation. The last thing that I need to just highlight is that when we are looking at the South African context of AI regulation, we must not forget the approaches of the African Union as well, which we'll touch on a little bit later during the presentation. Now, looking at the South African regulatory landscape, we currently see that there is no AI legislation in South Africa. Right, so we have nothing at this point dealing with AI legislation or any type of product liability flowing from AI. So very similar to Japan's position, until something is promulgated, we would follow a self-regulation type of approach. Obviously, the challenge with that is setting out standards and having conformity in terms of that. And there hasn't been a lot of work within a South African context to set out those standards up until recently. What we have done is, as early as April 2019, the Presidential Commission was formed, the PC4IR, and really their job was to look at current legislation and regulations and see where the gaps and deficiencies are within the current framework. And it would be useful for us just to consider what that current framework is at the moment. There's several pieces of legislation that touch on AI or could potentially be extended to AI, if I'm a little bit more accurate, but they are not sufficient. The major one is the Electronic Communications and Transactions Act, and specifically Section 20 in that particular piece of legislation, which conceptually would recognize autonomous contracting. But when we start analyzing Section 20 in a little bit more detail, you'll see that it falls short of AI being able to deal with the advanced AI technology. We have our Protection of Personal Information Act, which is basically equivalent to the GDPR in Europe. But again, there are deficiencies here, as we see Europe is developing in the free flow of data. We don't have equivalent legislation in that respect. Cyber Crimes Act, which allows for certain prosecutions for online criminal activity. And then very important to mention is the Consumer Protection Act. And I mention this because our equivalent of product liability legislation sits within the Consumer Protection Act, which is a bit of an odd place to put it, but that's where we're sitting with our product liability type of legislation. So this is basically where our regulatory framework at this point. There's obvious deficiencies in these pieces of legislation. So the DCT did in 2022 in November, they've launched the Artificial Intelligence Institute of South Africa, and they've developed quite a few AI hubs. This was done with the cooperation and with the partnership of the University of Johannesburg and the Tshwane University of Technology. So here you can see UJ is quite involved within this space within South Africa. Added to this, in April of this year, the DCTT proposed a discussion document on AI. And shortly after that, now in August, we have seen the Site Policy Framework document that's been published. Now, this has been published for comment and is really our first step towards developing a national policy in relation to AI. Now, this policy will, like many other jurisdictions, become the basis for AI regulations within South Africa. This is a very important place to pause because we need to understand where our policy position is to see how the EU AI Act will either add or be of benefit to the South African position. So let's have a little bit more of a look into the AI policy framework. Now, it recognizes as a starting point, when you do read it, it's quite a short document, it's about 20 odd pages. It recognizes this need for comprehensive policy and comprehensive regulation. But what makes it quite unique is that when we consider the AI policy framework, there's a great focus within the South African socio-economic setting. There's a belief that AI technology is the source and solution to many of the socioeconomic challenges that exist within the South African environment. So the AI policy framework sits then on three general pillars that the focus is directed at. It's the ethical impact of AI, the social impact, and then obviously the economic impact. The economic impact is generally thought that AI technology will solve things like employment issues and issues in relation to access to technology and certain resources. Interesting enough, though, the AI policy framework only identifies three risks within the South African context: job displacements, in other words, unemployment, privacy concerns, and ethical issues. And when we start looking at this in the context of Europe's position, we see that there's almost nothing here in the policy framework talking about product liability or product risk. The closest thing that we're seeing is some privacy concerns that's linking in and having alignment from a European perspective. What the policy framework also does is it categorizes three broad areas of factors that will influence the eventual regulation of AI within South Africa. They put this forward as the pull of the future, which is really where we want to be, where we should be going towards as a country. The push of the present, in other words, the current issues that we're facing with now, and then the weight of the past, things that are weighing us down in terms of history and elements in relation to socioeconomic challenges. Now, if we start looking at the pull of the future, you'll see that there is a view from an AI policy framework perspective that AI will be the central force to create economic transformation and social equity within the South African space. Interesting enough, South Africa intends to be one of the global leaders within AI in terms of its engagement, which then pulls us into the current issues. There's obviously a huge move towards technology and its fast-paced developments, and there is a need for certain harmonization of policy to align with international trends. Now, Prof. Borges obviously spoke a little bit earlier about the cross-jurisdictional impact of the EU AI Act, and this is obviously recognized within the AI policy framework. But what is interesting is the weight of the past. Now, this is the, if I can call it this, the inhibitors that is currently holding South Africa back. We'll see things like the digital divide. So I've mentioned earlier that there are institutional and structural deficiencies in terms of not having access to data or internet in all areas within South Africa. And that obviously impacts our ability to effectively engage at an AI space. There are historical inequalities, and there are existing frameworks and institutions that are potentially inhibiting the full potential of AI. So all of this would have to be taken into account when we are looking at developing effective regulations within South Africa. Now, again, I'm highlighting two very important points where we can go and have a look at the EU AI Act for some guidance. That's the global leadership and the harmonization with international trends. From a strategic perspective, the South African policy seems to relate to 9 key pillars for its future regulation. And I mention them very quickly and briefly here because we don't have the time to go through it in too much detail. But the number one strategic pillar is talent management, and that's people, upskilling people with the use of AI for economic and industry benefit. Digital infrastructure, as I've mentioned, there's a need for developing that digital infrastructure to house and be able to harness the benefits of AI. A huge focus on the use of AI for improvement of the public sector. As you know, there are challenges in relation to that. The ethical use of AI, privacy and data protection, our safety and security within the AI systems, transparency and explainability, fairness and avoidance of bias, and then finally, the research and development of innovation. Now, when we go and look at the touch points here, we see that there are some touch points where we can go and have a look at the EU AI Act. Although we do have legislation of the Protection of Personal Information Act, there are developments within Europe that will add to that privacy and data protection elements. I do think that the EU AI Act sits squarely in the strategic pillar of number 6, which is our safety and security space, and to an extent on relation to transparency and explainability. So these are the general areas that there are touch points. Now, the South African strategic document can't fully be realized without also looking at the AU, African Union's perspective. And I've pulled this from the AU's strategic document on AI development, and this is quite an interesting diagram. I've put up the key at the bottom left-hand corner. And just to give you context, that this doesn't relate necessarily to AI regulation within Africa. This predominantly relates to data protection and data regulations. So from an African perspective, other than the dark green areas where there are AI strategy policies in place, predominantly and from an African perspective, we are still grappling with the issue of data protection regulations, let alone AI regulations. So my general feeling on this is that we would have to get this right first before we get into the AI space. Nevertheless, what we'll start seeing is more dark green areas within this map as we're progressing within the next year or two. Now, what's interesting from a AI strategy document in terms of the African Union is they've identified certain benefits. Now, all of these benefits, they seem to want to include within their regulation or recommendation within the African continent. And I highlight some of them because we'll see when we get to the risk section that there are some very important elements that would differentiate the African and South African approach to the EU. The maximization of AI benefits really talks about this leveraging of AI to resolve these socioeconomic issues within the African continent and within South Africa. And you'll see that it talks about public sector and private sector use. There's also the building of capabilities. Now, this is where we're talking about the individual, the AI skill sets, our data integrity, and our research and innovation. And then also the public sector and private sector investment. So there's some partnerships there. But it gets more interesting when we get to the risk section. So there are various risks associated with the use of AI. We know this. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been a EU AI Act. But from an African perspective, we see that there are specifically risks not just with AI safety and security, but also in terms of gender equality and inclusion and diversity of AI. Now, this is a little bit deceptive because when we get into the AI strategy document of the African Union, we start seeing different risks. And I'd like to highlight these. One of the risks highlighted is the environmental risk. Okay, so that is the climate change factors and CO2 emissions. They do recognize system level risks, which I think is very similar to what the EU position is. They look at things like bias and discrimination, privacy and personal data protection, but they don't go into product liability or product protection in terms of the system level risks, which is very interesting. It's an obvious gap within the African Union's document. But they also go into things called structural risks. So gender equality, and that's more from a societal perspective. The impact on jobs, which is a huge issue within South Africa and within the African Union. The AI divide, which is a variation to the digital divide, in distinguishing between the haves and don't have-nots. And that really does talk to infrastructure and resources within the particular country. The approach on intellectual property, so that is retained within a African-specific environment. But what's interesting is the risk identified to African values within the document. So there is a big concern in relation to societal cohesion, the maintaining of human rights, but also to avoid cultural exploitation. So that comes from a history of colonization and to ensure that the resources within the African continent does not get redirected. So what we see from this particular framework is that there must be a multifaceted approach to be able to deal with all these risks. The block that I've just highlighted there seems to me to be the major block that would have similarity with the EU AI Act. But what you'll see on the screen then is that there are many other risks that have been highlighted. To deal with these risks, we have to also be able to overcome digital inequalities, the infrastructure issues, and the availability of resources, the limitation of data, which will influence that risk, and then also the limitation of skills. So pulling this up from a strategic focus area, you'll see that I've just highlighted a lot of the risks that have been identified within the document that we've discussed, but there is an element of minimizing AI risks. But that minimization of AI risks are not limited to product liability or product-specific risks. It has a wider societal and economic focus area when we look at these types of strategic documents. Which brings us then to how does it compare between these approaches between the EU, the African Union, and South Africa. Now, Prof. Borges has done an exceptionally good job at the EU, so I don't need to go through that too much. But we see with the EU that there is a risk-based approach, and understandably so. In the first presentation, the description of deployers and providers were explained, and this system-based risk, product liability, being one of the core elements of the EU AI Act. But when we start moving over to the AU, or the African Union, we see that we need, or there's an appetite for multifaceted approaches. And this is not just a focus on system-based risks, but also environmental, structural, and African values. And this means that whatever type of regulation is going to eventually be promulgated within the different countries within the AU, it would have to be a more pervasive legislative approach. And this is purely because of the risks identified. There's obviously some learnings we can pull from the EU in terms of systems-specific risks, but there are areas that we would have to develop specifically for the African continent, for African-specific challenges. And that is a similar approach that we'll find within South Africa. Now, the South African strategic document has even less risks identified, which is really focused on jobs and privacy and ethics. There's very little focus in the strategic document that talks about system risks, but there is a greater focus on the socioeconomic factors, which does align with the African Union approach. So really the question comes down to which approaches are best. You know, there are important elements that we can learn from the EU AI Act, but there are also very specific socioeconomic elements and risks within the African continent that makes it unique, which means that we cannot, and it would be irresponsible of us to adopt the EU AI Act as is without considering these other factors. So can we use the EU model, and to what extent? Well, there are certain principles that are useful. There is this technology neutral approach, the risk-based approach, which deals with product liability. And we can see from the African Union and the South African strategic documents that there seems to be a deficiency and a focus on the product liability elements. We can certainly learn and add to the data governance and management, especially as South Africa is trying to be a leader within this space. So we have to follow the approaches from an international trend perspective. The transparency elements within the EU Act, specifically Article 50, can be of benefit, especially when we look at the strategic pillars under the South African strategic document. And then that database for AI high-risk systems, which would be quite beneficial. What makes and just a summary, what makes the African Union and South Africa a little bit more unique than just following that is that we need this pervasive regulatory system. So there are wider principles we need to look at than just product liability. There is a more complex, I believe, socioeconomic environment that's unique to Africa. And then there is the problem of digital infrastructure and resources that is always a challenge. I find quite a lot of comfort, if I may add, that Prof. Borges and Prof. Shimpo also showed that there are deficiencies and there's areas of improvement within the areas of EU and in Japan. And simply, this is also the case within South Africa. So in conclusion, and I know I'm running out of time, but in conclusion, South Africa is still in its infancy in relation to its view of AI regulation, but it's taking positive steps towards looking at regulations. And those regulations would have to take what works from the EU AI Act, but also make it African specific to deal with our challenges that we sit with on the continent. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.